I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be set aside.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that I be given 20 minutes to speak.
Is there objection? Majority Leader?
Objection whatsoever to the senator speaking, but was my understanding that he was going to ask some consent agreements, and I understand he has great persuasive talents in speaking, but I am not going to be able to do that. I interrupted my schedule today, which I was happy to do at the convenience of the senator from Texas. So I will be back in 20 minutes, and you can ask your consents at that time. Is that okay?
Well, I'm happy to ask the consents at the outset if that would be preferable.
That way, if you would do that, I'd really appreciate it. And you have my word. I will watch what I can. If I can't, I will read every word of it tonight.
And I am hopeful my remarks will be persuasive when you watch them.
My friend is always persuasive.
Without objection.
The first unanimous consent request that I would put forward, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate agree to the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 59, that no debate, amendments, or motion to the resolution be in order, that any and all points of order be waived, that the resolution be read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table without any intervening action or debate.
Mr. President,
is there objection?
Yes, reserving the right to object. Mr. President, my friend gets right to the point, and I appreciate that. I understand the junior senator from Texas asked consent to pass the House-passed continuing resolution by consent without any amendments, and I understand that. As I said, he got right to the point. The House-passed resolution, as we know now, would defund the Obamacare. It would block not only the administration of the program, but all related benefits as well, and that's untoward. Second, it includes so-called debt prioritization language, or what has been called the Pay China First policy. This would leave us vulnerable to default on our obligations to everyone else besides bondholders and Social Security. Everyone from veterans to small businesses, to federal employees, contractors, to doctors, hospitals, and Medicare patients generally. So, Mr. President, the President would veto this continuing resolution, so it is not going to become law anyway, and I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, the second unanimous request that I would put forward, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate agree to the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 59, that any and all points of order be waived, that during consideration of H.J. Res. 59, adoption of any amendments be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold, and that upon disposition of all amendments, the resolution be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table without any intervening action or debate.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. Mr. President, I again understand the senator from Texas in his request, which would create a new 60-vote hurdle where the Senate rules do not require one at the present time. Mr. President, I really try to follow the Senate rules. Sometimes they are obnoxious, and I wish they were different, but I try my best in leading us in this difficult Senate sometimes to live up to all the rules as they exist. Senate rules set up a lot of hurdles. That's the way the precedents have been developed over the years, and I understand that. Sometimes senators like these, sometimes they don't. I'd guess that most would say that senators have enough 60-vote hurdles, that the Senate has enough of these really arbitrary hurdles as it is. We don't add even more barriers to getting things done. Mr. President, we should be careful about adding new barriers. The American people are really fed up. I mean, I travel the country, and it's rare that I go someplace that they don't say, what are you going to do to change the rules? They know what the rules are and how difficult they are. And I would bet the vast majority of the senators, Democrats and Republicans, would like them changed. The problem is, Mr. President, we've tried that recently We were able to make a little headway, but not a lot. So I think that most Americans would rather we work on ways to agree, to work together, rather than disagree. And I almost would bet, although I'm not a betting man, that most Americans would rather we avoid shutting down the government. Mr. President, I know the sincerity of the senator from Texas. I understand that. I disagree with him. I hope as sincerely as he disagrees with me. But I don't take away from his sincerity. But having said that, I am in a position now to object, and I must do that.
Objection is heard. Senator from Texas? No?
I've been asked to do a brief unanimous consent request.
I'm happy to yield.
I have only one consent request for a committee to meet during today's session. It has my approval and that of Senator McConnell. I'd ask consent that this request be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas?
at this point, I now ask unanimous consent that I be allowed 20 minutes to speak.
Without objection.
Mr. President, these two unanimous consent requests have the virtue of being clarifying what this debate is that the Senate will face this week. And I'm going to suggest to you, Mr. President, the Senate has not faced a more important debate in the short time that you and I have both served in this institution. No American wants a government shutdown. I don't want a government shutdown. No one on this side of the aisle wants a government shutdown. The House of Representatives doesn't want a government shutdown. Mr. President, 5 minutes ago, the Senate could have acted to prevent a government shutdown. The request that I promulgated to the Majority Leader was to pass the continuing resolution that the House of Representatives passed, and if that had happened, there would be no government shutdown. A government shutdown would be taken off the table. The specter that you and I see on the television screen every day, the countdown clock that has started to appear, would disappear. But unfortunately, the Majority Leader chose to object and to say no. He would rather risk a government shutdown than act to prevent it. Now, why? Again, the Majority Leader was quite candid. Because he supports the law called Obamacare. And I would note a component of that also. One of the pieces that the House of Representatives passed was a law that has been called the Default Prevention Act. The President of the United States has been doing a fair amount of public speaking, raising the prospect of a default on our debt. And the House of Representatives acted boldly to include in their continuing resolution language that would say the United States will never, ever, ever default on its debt. That in the event the debt ceiling is not raised, we will always pay our debt first. Now, I suspect every member of this body has spoken publicly about the calamity that would come from a default on the debt. I think it is quite revealing that the Majority Leader explicitly referenced and objected to by name taking a default off the table. I think that's unfortunate. There is a tendency in this town towards brinksmanship, towards pointing to events that can cause instability and uncertainty and using them to try to get your way. I wish the Majority Leader had been willing to step forward and say, I agree, number one, that the government should be funded. We should not have a government shutdown. And number two, that we should never, ever, ever even discuss a default on the debt. Had the Majority Leader simply said, I consent, a default on the debt would have been taken permanently off the table. Now, why didn't he? We all know why he did not. Because the Majority Leader embraces Obamacare. I'm going to suggest to you, Mr. President, that this body, a little over 3 years ago, passed Obamacare. It passed it on a straight party line vote. And in the time since it's passed, America has learned that it's not working. Americans all over this country are suffering because of Obamacare. It is the single biggest job killer in America. Every day, we're seeing more and more evidence that Obamacare is killing jobs, that it is hurting American workers who are struggling, that it is causing people to be forcibly put into part-time work 29 hours a week, that it is jacking up their health insurance premiums, and it's causing more and more people who are struggling to lose their health insurance altogether. Just today, the New York Times reported that because of Obamacare, quote, insurers are significantly limiting the choices of doctors and hospitals available to consumers. That's today in the newspaper. USA Today reported on a new, quote, family glitch that could cause up to 500,000 children to go without insurance coverage. A headline in the Washington Post today read, quote, 1 week away, Obamacare's small business insurance exchanges not all ready for launch. And even the labor unions that once championed Obamacare are now publicly decrying it as a threat to the 40-hour work week that is the backbone of the American middle class. That is in the words of organized labor. This law is hurting the American people, and it's why there is bipartisan consensus outside of Washington, D.C., that we need to step up and stop it. That would be the responsible thing for senators on both sides of the aisle to do, to say the same rules should apply to hardworking American families that apply to big corporations and that apply to members of Congress. We've seen the president unilaterally put in place exceptions for giant corporations and members of Congress. Mr. President, I would submit hardworking American families deserve that same exception. So I think it is unfortunate that the majority leader chose to object to continuing government, to preventing a shutdown, to taking a default off the table, but I do think it is clarifying to make clear, as the majority leader just did, that he is willing to risk a government shutdown. He is willing to force even a government shutdown in order to insist that Obamacare is funded. And Mr. President, that leads to the second unanimous consent request that I put forward. A simple request that every amendment on this continuing resolution be subject to 60 votes. Now, Mr. President, everyone in this body knows that is not an unusual request in the United States Senate. Amendments in this body are routinely subjected to 60-vote thresholds. Indeed, you and I will both recall just a few months ago when this body was debating the issue of guns, a contentious issue, an emotional issue, an issue of great moment to this country. The majority leader agreed with the minority that every single amendment on the floor would be subject to a 60-vote threshold. Those were the terms under which every aspect of the gun debate was debated. I would note that one amendment that was submitted during that gun debate was the Cruz amendment. It was the law enforcement amendment that put real teeth in going after felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy guns. It put real teeth into forcing states to report mental health records so that we can prevent those with serious mental illnesses from illegally purchasing firearms. And I would note, Mr. President, that the Cruz bill received a majority vote in this institution. A majority of senators voted for it, including 9 Democrats. It was the most comprehensive, it was the most bipartisan of the comprehensive gun legislation voted on in this body. And yet it did not pass into law because the majority leader set a 60-vote threshold for every amendment. I would suggest that Obamacare is no less important. Obamacare is no less controversial, and Obamacare likewise should be subject to the same threshold. If the majority leader believes Obamacare is good for America, if the Democrats in this body believe Obamacare is good for America, then I would encourage this body, let's debate. Not in the artificial sense in which we debate 1 or 2 senators talking to an empty hall, but in the real sense of making the case to each other and the American people about whether this law is working or whether it is not, because everywhere I travel in the state of Texas and across the country, Americans come to me and raise the single biggest challenge they're facing is Obamacare. It's killing their jobs. It's taking away their health care. It isn't working. Now, we all know that 3.5 years ago, Obamacare was forced into law on a strict party line vote by straight brute force. But it shouldn't be funded that way. That's not the way a government should proceed. That's not the way this institution should proceed. A 60-vote threshold does not require that the majority leader get a great many Republican votes, but it does require that he get a few, that he cannot simply do it with the votes of only the Democrats in this body. This country will be better off if we work together to restore economic growth and to stop the incredible job loss that is coming from Obamacare. In fact, regarding a 60-vote threshold, here's what the learned majority leader has had to say. Quote, "For more than 200 years, the rules of the Senate have protected the American people, and rightfully so. The need to muster 60 votes in order to terminate Senate debate naturally frustrates the majority and oftentimes the minority. I am sure it will frustrate me when I assume the office of majority leader in a few weeks. But I recognize this requirement as a tool that serves the long-term interest of the Senate and the American people and our country." I agree with Majority Leader Reid. I agree that 60-vote thresholds ensure that we behave not just on a partisan matter, but in a way that brings us together, and given the challenges coming from Obamacare, I believe nothing is hurting the American people more. Nothing is hurting the economy more. Nothing is damaging jobs more than Obamacare. Given the majority leader's objection raised today, the path that the majority intends to go is now clear. It is clear for Democrats, it is clear for Republicans, it is clear for the world to see. The majority leader has stated it is his intention to force a vote to fund Obamacare, and to do so using just 51 votes, to do so on what could be a straight party line vote, and in all likelihood would be a straight party line vote. Mr. President, I would suggest that is not a responsible course of action. And it's not a course of action that I think Republicans should acquiesce to. If it is the majority leader's intent to fund Obamacare using just 51 votes, then I would submit to every Republican in this body, it is our obligation to our constituents to do everything we can to prevent the majority leader from funding Obamacare with just 51 votes. Any member of this body that votes for cloture on this bill will be voting to allow the majority leader to fund Obamacare on 51 votes. I think that vote's a mistake. I think that vote disserves our constituents. I think that vote hurts the people of America. 232 members of the House of Representatives came together and said explicitly, "Do not fund Obamacare." I would note that included 2 Democrats who came together with their Republicans in a bipartisan manner to say, this law isn't working. Maybe we thought it would work, but the facts, the evidence have proven that it is not working. The Senate should do likewise. The House acted last week because the House listened to the American people. And Mr. President, I would suggest that every member of this body should do exactly the same thing. Listen to the American people, because if we listen to the American people, we will, number one, keep the government running. I wish the majority leader had agreed to my request to take a government shutdown off the table by passing the House continuing resolution. If we listen to the American people, we will, number two, take any default on the debt off the table. I wish the majority leader had not objected to doing so right now. I wish the majority leader had not said he intends to continue to use the threat of a default to engage in brinksmanship to try to force Obamacare on the American people. And if we listen to the American people, we will recognize that this law is not working. That is why big corporations asked for and received an exception. That is why members of Congress asked for and received an exception. That is why unions have just recently come forward and asked for an exception. They have not yet been granted. But I'll venture a prediction now, which if Congress votes to continue funding Obamacare, that union exemption will not be far away. And then we will be left in a world where the burdens of Obamacare, the job-killing consequences of Obamacare, fall just on hardworking American families, not on big corporations, not on members of Congress, and in the near future, I predict not on union bosses, only on hardworking American families, on single moms, on young people, on people struggling to climb the economic ladder. Mr. President, I would suggest that's getting it exactly backwards. This body should not be granting special rules, special favors for the ruling class, for those with power and privilege. We should be fighting for those who are struggling, and those are the people that are getting hurt the most by Obamacare. I believe this week will be a critical week for the United States Senate, where every one of us, and I hope to see Republicans and Democrats, stand together and to say, setting aside partisan differences, we have an obligation to the people of our states. And Obamacare isn't working. And so we're going to step forward and recognize the simple reality that it's the biggest job killer in this country, and we should not affirmatively fund it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.